Hi everyone, greetings from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. It's a little bit of a wet and rainy afternoon here. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you there in person, but I think I'm doing the second best thing to be able to join you through video. And if the technology god is willing, at the end of this presentation, we will be able to engage in a little bit of question and answer period, and you might be able to raise some questions for me about the presentation, or you may want to challenge some of the things that I have to say. Before I start, I'd like to also thank the organizer, the Biomed Central, and the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana, for hosting this event and for including me in the agenda. It looks like a very rich agenda, and look forward to interacting with some of you. I also want to do a shout out to my colleague Helena Ashwell Hassan, for the university librarian there. Helena has been doing a great job promoting open access at the university and throughout Africa and beyond. So it's fantastic that she's also hosting this event at her university. Before I start the main part of my presentation, I'd like to first apologize for the ambitious nature of the title that I've chosen. I'm obviously from outside of Africa, and the experience that I have gained over the years through working with many different colleagues who are native to Africa, and I've learned a lot from them. So my presentation is really a way of sharing some of their ideas, and in fact I will be bringing some videos of some of my colleagues speaking on behalf of their own understanding and initiatives. A broad overview of what I'd like to accomplish. I would like to start off giving you a brief introduction of a collaborative project called BioLine International that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with over the last 15 years. We're going to tell you a little bit about the goals and objectives of this project. And then I want to quickly move to a very brief overview of the changing landscape of scholarly communications and our changing understanding of open access and what it means, and how this movement, open access movements, is more and more converging with a number of other broad movements, including so-called e-science and e-research, and increasingly movement towards open science and sharing of open data. At the same time, there are many calls for rethinking about the traditional metrics of scholarly communication, primarily the journal impact factor that has been so dominant in terms of measuring so-called journal impact and quality around the world. And with the rise of open access and the rise of social media, there are many different opportunities that are available for researchers to share scholarly communication throughout the entire process of the scholarly communication life cycle, not only the end products of scholarly research itself. And we tend to think about the products, namely the journal articles or the monograph, as being sort of the final outcome of research. And open access, open research in general is opening up possibility of the entire life cycle of the research process being subject to different kinds of interpretation and evaluation and different kinds of metrics that may be far more relevant, particularly in the developing countries context. So I would like to bring in the second set of arguments having to do with expanding the notion of what constitutes scholarly communications, what constitutes scholarly publications, and the kinds of impact measures that we can beginning to use to look at different types and the different multiple impacts that research can bring. And in a developing countries context, we're more interested in the impact research has on development issues, alleviation of food insecurity, improvement of public health, improvement of governance, transparency, and improvement in democracy, human rights, and social engagement. All these can be linked to research outcomes, and there are opportunities now to think beyond the traditional impact factors in an open access environment. And so we want to try to link the way social medias and different types of tools for scholarly communications are being used and how they allow us to come to new measures of social impact and research for impact. And these will be discussed in the context of opportunities for African researchers and institutions. So that is really, in a nutshell, what I would like to attempt to cover. So first, I'd like to say a few words about BioLine International. This is a project that was started back in 1993, really in the very early days of the internet and the World Wide Web. And it was started by my colleagues Barbara Kershaw from the UK and Vanderlei Canhos from Brazil. Both are microbiologists who saw the potential of the internet in sharing scientific information, particularly between colleagues from the developing world. And this project has been supported by Vanderlei's organization called CREA, the Reference Center on Environmental Information, ever since, and they have been providing volunteer support to this project for this audit since 1993. And that's why when you look at the URL of the BioLine, it has .br in the end there. Inside the BioLine website, you will find a listing or directory to over 60 journals from various parts of the world, and a number of African countries are represented here. In particular, Nigeria has a fair number of journals, as does Uganda, followed by Tanzania and Kenya. In terms of subject area, most of the journals are in the areas of the health and medical sciences, followed by areas of crop science and nutrition, and then followed by environmental sciences. The reason we concentrated in these areas is that we felt that these are the topics and research area that have the most pressing development linkages. It is important to remember that BioLine International is not a publisher. We're simply an aggregator, and we provide a platform for journals that do not have the infrastructures to provide electronic dissemination. We also provide additional metadata enrichment to the journal articles and linking them to databases that are in the open access environment. And we're also able to link into many libraries around the world through different networks, and this is a way to expose the research from through these various journals. So really the ultimate goal is to increase the visibilities of our participating partners. I'm sure many participants at this meeting are aware of the many challenges facing small independent journals based in Africa. Many of them suffer from the so-called Volume 1, Issue 1 syndrome. That is, they get started, but they are not able to sustain for various reasons, either not getting enough funding or not enough contributions or enough peer reviews and so forth. And many also suffer from irregular publications. There are exceptions, however, and this is one of the success stories, the African Health Sciences based at Makerere University Medical School. And I'm sure there are many others as well. And this morning you heard about the Pan-African Medical Journal, for example. This is African Health Science is also one of the few African-based journals that is indexed in ISI and also archived in PubMed. However, we like to emphasize that getting journals into ISI is not the primary goal of BioLine. Again, exposing the research and to make it as widely disseminated as possible is the primary goal. And if it does get indexed in ISI, it's just a coincidence. Now, I will return to ISI in a minute. I would like to turn to some usage statistics for a moment. Usage statistics are always tricky to interpret, but we just want to point out here the broad trend in terms of increasing usage over time. And in 2010, we have over 4.5 million full-text download that attests to strong demand for the articles in the database. And we took a snapshot occasionally to see where people are coming from. And this snapshot of a 1-month period last year shows that users are in fact coming from many parts of this global south. And when we looked at the cities that many of the users are coming from, many of them are in fact in the developing world. So it shows a very interesting pattern of demand. When we look at the network location, we also notice that there's some interesting indications of usage from African institutions. Particularly interesting is the African Virtual University Network that have been accessing the articles in the database. When BioLine International was started back in the early 90s, the term open access was not in use yet, and BioLine was one of the parties that was invited to the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2001, at which the definition of open access was formally adopted. And ever since then, BioLine has been very active in terms of not just the practice of open access, but in terms of trying to understand the impact of open access in the developing world. And there are a number of research questions that we have been looking at closely, and we're beginning to get some ideas and data that would allow us towards answering these very important questions. And I would say that we can say a partial yes to all of these questions, and these are very important questions to be raised because it reminds us that open access is not simply about improving one's scholarly citation or citation advantage, as some people have argued, but there are in fact broader implications as far as research outcomes and why research is conducted in the first place. And one of the reasons why research is done in the first place is to improve the human conditions. And yet, without the research capacity to do research, that is obviously not possible. So this is why this particular Global Forum for Health Research report suggests that improving research capacity is the key to health and development. And this goes with other aspects of human conditions. And what this report points to in terms of the 1090 gaps of neglected diseases is also applicable to the neglected knowledge. And I would argue that a lot of this, the reason for neglect has to do with world system that values certain kinds of research and values certain kinds of scholarship and ignore the other kinds of scholarship emanating from the global south. And if you look at this particular graphic representation, you'll see that, and not surprisingly, most of the citations and publications are coming from the global north. 15 of the industrial countries account for 85% of the citations. And if you look at the middle strip there of the whole continent of Africa is entirely invisible except for South Africa, which sort of dangles there. This doesn't mean that there are no knowledge or no research coming out of Africa. It's just that the yardstick by which research were judged to be legitimate and quality is decided by a standard that is not fair to the rest of the world. And one of the consequences of this system is that many researchers from the developing worlds are encouraged or forced to publish in so-called international journals. And the result is that a lot of the research that are of local relevance are ignored in favor of research questions that are more likely to be published in so-called international journals. So local research are ignored, and a lot of local solutions are not being looked at as a result. And by the same token, a lot of the research that are published in the North are not necessarily relevant to researchers in the South. So as a result, we have a two-pronged problem. One is access to the research, but not only access to the research, but access to relevance research that are pertinent to issues that people face in the global South. I would like to give an example of a case of neglected knowledge in African research. Here's a case of Professor Mary Abukusta Onyango, who's an agricultural researcher at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Science of Agriculture and Technology. And Mary has been studying African indigenous vegetables for over a decade. And the reason she's interested in studying African native vegetables is because many of these vegetables are forgotten by many of the people in East Africa, even though these are highly nutritious vegetables that she used to eat when she was a kid and that her parents and grandparents used to eat. And these are vegetables that are well adapted to many of the soil conditions in Eastern Africa. And yet, because of the importation of Western vegetables and Western research, these vegetables have largely been forgotten, and so has the research on these vegetables. And Mary told of a case of early days when she tried to publish one of her journal article and submit it to northern journals, and one of the reviewers wrote back and says, oh, they don't publish paper on weeds, they only publish paper on edible vegetables. Of course, the reviewer didn't know these are edible vegetables because he's never been exposed to it. And so Mary began to publish her paper in journals that are based in Africa. This one in particular, the African Crop Science Journal, and another fairly recent open access journal started by Professor Ruth Onyango called African Journal of Food, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Development. Now, through publishing her papers in these journals, Mary's work began to be disseminated and read by other researchers in Africa and beyond, because through the portal, anybody can access her research, and her research became better known. I will let Professor Mary Onyango speak for herself.
Open access journals are inevitable. They are very, very important at this point in time. Why am I saying that? Because everybody is to benefit. Because when we are doing research, it does not make sense if you keep it under the table or in the closet. We need to share the information, the research we do, however little it is, so long as it can have an impact on development, on people's livelihoods, and people's way of thinking. So open access journals, I believe, will help us do that. It will help us reach all the stakeholders, ranging from the researchers, the policymakers, the consumers, the students, and even farmers in the case of agricultural information, and people on the ground, because we have enlightened farmers who go to the internet and read, and they will see this. The only suggestion I want to make that as we write scientific journals, we must have a translation phase so that we have different information package for different clientele. If we are targeting the scientific community, we write scientific papers. If we are targeting policymakers, we do policy briefs. If we were targeting the farmers, we do brochures that are simplified and pictorial, easy to understand. And I think if we go that way, we shall be able to disseminate a lot of our information. And I must add that in Kenya and in most of African universities, like in my university, we have a lot of theses. Although research is not optimal, but the little we have done is lying in as great literature in our universities. If this could be exposed, translated, and put on the open access journal, will go a long way in achieving some of the Millennium Development Goals that relates to poverty alleviation, that relates to food and nutrition and hunger in Africa and other developing countries.
So Mary spoke about this important aspect called knowledge translation. which is post-publication dissemination of knowledge, but it is also about how specialized knowledge need to be turned into forms that are usable to the people that can benefit from them. And in health, this is increasingly well understood, and the same applies to other areas of research, particularly in the areas of agriculture and food security. So unless this knowledge is made accessible to the people who could benefit them, the research itself is not complete. And yet, in order to do the knowledge translation work, there is a clear need for access to that knowledge, to that specialized knowledge in the first place. More importantly, in order to encourage researchers to do this type of work, one has to think about the reward system, because as it stands, the academic reward system only reward those people who published in high-impact journals. And so the mentality that only give recognitions to publications in peer-reviewed journals and in Northern journals and in high international journals will continue to discourage researchers to do important work to translate their knowledge into local problems solving. So there is a clear need to change the academic reward system, or to change the incentive system to recognize individuals and researchers who are engaged in opening up their research for the betterment of human conditions. And so these kind of call for changes coincide with a number of emerging changes in scholarly communication itself. Now we are seeing people calling for more kinds of knowledge representation, meaning more kinds of publishable scholarships, not just in the traditional article format, but in different multimedia kinds of representation, but also publications that link not just the final paper, but also the underlying data. And in order to do so, we have to have better agreement on the standard of sharings, and again on understanding how it is that sharing can enable better discovery. And at the same time, because of more cross-disciplinary exchanges, new methodologies are being developed, and new ideas and new way of questioning existing questions are also happening. Recently, the SURF Foundation, based in the Netherlands, released a set of results that they funded on a number of experimentation on different kinds of what they call enhanced publications that integrate different kinds of underlying data, images, and so forth in different disciplines. And they trying to make use of the semantic web technology to better link paper and data and ideas in different contexts. Now, all these also lead to questions about the traditional metric, because these papers don't fall into traditional category of a published paper. How do we evaluate the impact of these different kinds of representation? And so we need to clearly develop better tools and better way of capturing the data, and at the same time, better way of valuing the different kinds of research and their outcomes. So this is really a call for looking at development of multiple indicators. And I think we have some important lessons we've learned from many years of development work. And one of the problems we discover is that over-reliance on the gross domestic product as a measure of a nation's development has had some rather negative consequences, because it encourages unfettered growth and ignore very different dimensions of human well-being. So just because the country's GDP keep going up doesn't mean that somehow is better developed, because inequality can still be a very serious issue, and yet GDP doesn't reflect the growing inequality in some countries despite the growth of GDP. I think the same can be said of the journal impact factor. Journal impact factor encourages certain kind of behavior, citation, gaming, and publishing in certain kinds of journals and the concentrations of the certain kinds of journals at the detriment of the kind of diversity and the local needs that has been neglected. So we need to rethink the value and the system of evaluation by expanding the kind of ways that we look at scholarship. And I think we also need to look at the relationship between the scholarship and the institutional, social, and political relations, because none of these things exist in isolation. Publication exists in a social context. Research exists in a social context. But so far we have often looked at publication as a one-dimensional object. And so we need to dissect this whole research process and say, where do we value certain kinds of outcomes, and how do we reward different kinds of collective behavior and different kinds of research results and objects that may have different kind of value by itself. So by reevaluating our reward and recognition system, we can begin to move away from this traditional notion of the core exporting knowledge to the periphery or from the north to the south to a situation where we find peers are collaborating between south and north and south without this whole north-south divide being a part of it. And so we are seeing that open access is beginning to enable this kind of true peer-to-peer networking. And the network itself, in turn, is enabling more and more open access. And interestingly, Carolyn Wagner, in her recent book, has wrote about this phenomenon. And she also pointed out that this kind of virtual and collaborative networks can in fact play a very vital role, particularly in a developing country. And she argues that instead of urging researchers in the South to imitate researchers in the North, that is, to publish in high-impact journal and to invest in certain kinds of big science, that researchers and policymakers focusing on research for development in the South should look at local research and local innovation as a way to encourage the building of local infrastructure. And so this is a call for a move from so-called big science to network science and to the use of knowledge for local problem solving. And I would like to again draw on a colleague to say a few words about the importance of local knowledge.
For too long in developing countries, education is about taking what is foreign and making it local, and ignoring, in the developing world anyway, ignoring the wealth that is right where you are standing. And I think open access is about digging the well right in front of you and getting the riches and the water and questing and removing the thirst from here, and then being able to have energy to go further afield and integrate that knowledge for service to your community.
So in conclusion, I'd like to reiterate some of the policy needs that I already alluded to earlier, and to add a few more. And obviously, for this kind of network science to happen, we still need to not forget about the whole bandwidth issue. Without the proper bandwidth and more bandwidth, much of this is just theorizing. And then, of course, we need to encourage better use and development of metadata and different use of open licenses. And most importantly, we need to think about how to incentivize researchers so that they would engage in this kind of non-proprietary and collaborative research. And then finally, and it may seem a little bit ironic as we started talking about BioLine and helping developing country journals, what we would like to see is that we have to move beyond the journal, because journal is really an artifact of the 20th century. With the network, we have opportunities to engage in different kinds of research dissemination, and African researchers are poised to take advantage of these. Just as many innovative use of cell phone technologies are being rolled out in various African countries, I think there are going to be lots and lots of new innovations. But these innovations ought to be nurtured and encouraged. And so even if they're not going to be traditional in the sense of publishing in a ISI journal, they need to be recognized and they need to be funded. And this is where I think African researchers will have the greatest potential. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this presentation makes sense to you. And I believe we do have time now for a few minutes of question, and hopefully the Skype is working as it should.